and 75-year-old male back pain. It's 211 Silver Hollow Road between Lane Road and Crosspatch Road.
It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon in Frankfurt, Germany, until a group of schoolchildren stumbled onto a scene from a nightmare. Walking through a pedestrian tunnel by a small creek, the children froze at the sight of what looked like a body lying on the concrete ledge inside. At first, they didn't comprehend the horror. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they realized a young boy was sprawled there, deathly still. His clothes were soaked with blood. Terrified, the children ran to get help. When police arrived at the tunnel, they were confronted with one of the most gruesome crime scenes in the city's history. The victim was a 13-year-old student named Tristan Brübach, and his murder would become one of Germany's most haunting unsolved cases. Tristan's body lay just 25 meters inside the tunnel, which runs alongside the Liederbach stream in the Höchst district of Frankfurt. Investigators could immediately tell this was no ordinary killing. Tristan had been savagely beaten and strangled, and his throat had been slashed so deeply that the knife cut into his spinal cord. The brutality hadn't ended there. The murderer had mutilated the boy's corpse, cutting away pieces of flesh from his buttocks and thighs and even removing both of his testicles. Seasoned officers were shaken. One later described it as the worst crime scene Frankfurt had seen since the Second World War. In fact, the injuries were so severe that Tristan wasn't immediately recognizable. Police had to check the name label in his discarded school backpack to identify him. News of the atrocity spread quickly, and a shocked community asked, who could do something so monstrous to a child, in broad daylight? The answer, decades later, is still unknown. The murder of Tristan Brübach remains unsolved, a cold case that continues to haunt Frankfurt. But in the days and weeks after March 26, 1998, detectives vowed to leave no stone unturned. They began tracing Tristan's final hours, hoping the boy's routine might hold clues to the killer's identity. As investigators would learn, Tristan's last day had started out entirely normal, until it took a sinister turn. Tristan Brübach was an only child being raised by his father, Bernd, in the suburb of Höchst. Born in 1984, Tristan had already known hardship in his short life. When he was 10, his mother Iris died tragically, leaving Tristan and his father grief-stricken and alone. His grandmother moved in to help care for him, but the loss affected Tristan deeply. He grew into a shy, somewhat sullen boy, though those who knew him say he had a kind heart. Tristan loved animals, he doted on his pet rabbit, and he would often walk up to strangers in the neighborhood just to pet their dogs. Despite his quiet nature, he was streetwise and independent for his age, frequently wandering the area on his own after school. Like many kids on the cusp of their teens, he was eager to seem older and cooler than he was. He even picked up smoking cigarettes to impress the tougher boys at school, though it did little to stop some classmates from bullying him. By early 1998, Tristan was 13 and in the 7th grade, a kid struggling with adolescence, but no different, it seemed, from countless others. Thursday, March 26, 1998, was the last day of school before the Easter holiday. That morning, Tristan tried to avoid going to school at all. He complained of a sore back and asked his father to let him stay home or see a doctor, but his father sensed the boy was faking and sent him on to class. Tristan arrived at school on time and attended classes for a few hours. Restless to start his break early, he made another attempt to leave. Around lunchtime, Tristan told a teacher his back hurt badly and persuaded them to let him go home early so he could visit a doctor. The teacher excused him. At about 1:30 p.m., Tristan walked out of the school building, released into an afternoon of freedom, and into the path of a killer. After leaving school, Tristan headed toward the nearby Frankfurt-Höchst train station, a local transit hub. A classmate saw him around 2 p.m. boarding a bus that was headed for the station. Another student glimpsed Tristan sitting alone on a bench at Höchst station sometime between 2:15 and 2:30 p.m., looking as if he might be waiting for someone. If Tristan had made plans for that afternoon, no one in his family was aware, he was simply expected to come home at his usual time. What we do know is that Tristan lingered around the station area for a while. At some point between roughly 2:30 and 3:15 p.m., he meandered over to a small park across the street from the station, a green space called Bruno-Anlage. There, on a park bench under the early spring sky, Tristan encountered a woman walking her dog, a seemingly innocent, chance meeting that would provide investigators with the last benign sighting of the boy. The woman would later tell police that around 3:20 p.m. she saw a lone boy sitting on the bench and stopped when he politely asked if he could pet her small dog. The boy introduced himself as Tristan and struck up a bit of friendly chatter. He mentioned that he loved animals and had a pet rabbit at home. The woman noticed Tristan was smoking a cigarette, a habit that made him look a bit older, even though he was clearly just a young teen. Their conversation was brief and pleasant. Nothing seemed amiss. After a minute or two, the woman continued on her way, leaving Tristan on the bench. But as she walked off, she happened to glance back over her shoulder, and saw something that in hindsight chills her to the bone. Two unfamiliar men had approached Tristan and sat down on the bench with him. One man sat to Tristan's left, the other to his right, effectively boxing him in. They looked to be adults, older than Tristan, but the woman didn't get a good look at their faces. She would later recall that the men struck her as probably foreign, though she couldn't specify why. Perhaps it was their dress or an impression she had. The sight gave her an uneasy feeling. Tristan did not appear to know these men well. Moments earlier he'd been alone. Still, there was no obvious distress visible from a distance. For all the witness knew, the two men could have been relatives or family friends meeting him. She brushed off her worries and left the park. That fleeting moment was the last time anyone saw Tristan Brübach alive. What happened next in the timeline comes from evidence and eyewitness accounts pieced together after the fact. Sometime in the next 10 to 30 minutes, around 3:30 p.m., Tristan crossed under the railroad tracks via the Liederbach Tunnel, a pedestrian underpass that ran below the train lines near the park. Perhaps he was taking a known shortcut on his way home, as he often did. Perhaps he was lured there by someone on the pretext of an errand or adventure. We may never know for sure. But we do know that at approximately 3:30, 3 children walking in the area approached the mouth of that tunnel and noticed something very strange. These 3 kids, about Tristan's age, were headed to a local soccer field and intended to use the tunnel as a shortcut. As they neared the tunnel's south entrance, they spotted a grimy-looking man inside the underpass, a short distance in. This man was bent over some kind of object on the ground. The children paused, watching from a distance of perhaps 50 meters. They could not clearly see what he was doing, only that he seemed to be fiddling with or hunched over something large and motionless. The tunnel was dim and the figure's back was partially turned, so the kids were unsure what they were witnessing. After about 1 or 2 minutes of this, an instinctual fear took hold and the children decided not to go into the tunnel. Instead, they wisely turned around and chose an alternate route to their destination, giving the eerie stranger a wide berth. Unknowingly, these young witnesses had likely seen Tristan's murderer in the act of desecrating his body, mere minutes after the killing. Their description of the odd-looking man would later prove crucial, but at that moment, the 3 friends simply hurried away, trying to shake off the unsettling sight. The Liederbach Tunnel, where this mystery man was lurking, is partly subterranean and poorly lit. By late afternoon it would have been cloaked in shadows, concealing the horror taking place within. And so, for another hour or so, Tristan's body lay in darkness, undiscovered. It wasn't until around 5 p.m. that the next group of passers-by came upon the scene, and unlike the earlier children, they came much closer and realized something was terribly wrong. This second group was composed of younger school children on their way to a nearby after-school daycare around 5 o'clock. They entered the tunnel and immediately saw Tristan's bloody corpse lying on the concrete ledge near the water. The kids could see that the boy was obviously dead and brutally injured. Screaming, they ran out of the tunnel and back to their daycare to get help. Teachers at the daycare cautiously accompanied the children back to the tunnel, hoping perhaps that it was a prank or misunderstanding. What they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. A mutilated child's body carefully posed as if sleeping. The teachers quickly ushered the children away and called the police at 5:08 p.m. Within minutes, police cars and ambulances converged at the park and the tunnel, their flashing lights illuminating a crime scene that would haunt everyone involved. View inside the Liederbach Tunnel in Frankfurt-Höchst, the dim location where Tristan's body was found on March 26, 1998. In 1998 this tunnel had no lighting and was partially hidden by shrubbery. It provided a secluded shortcut beneath busy train tracks, an ironically public place for such a horrific crime. It was here that school children stumbled upon Tristan's lifeless body, laid out on the concrete walkway by the shallow stream. Homicide detectives from the Frankfurt police sealed off the tunnel and immediately began searching for clues. They noted that one of Tristan's shoes was missing from his foot and had been placed on top of his chest by the killer. This strange detail suggested a possible sequence of events. Investigators theorized that Tristan had been attacked just outside the tunnel entrance, a violent struggle in which his shoe was knocked off. The assailant likely overpowered the boy quickly, rendering him unconscious by blows or strangulation. Drag marks in the dirt indicated Tristan's limp body was then dragged into the tunnel. Once concealed in the tunnel's darkness, the killer cut Tristan's throat, severing vital blood vessels in a quick, brutal slash. Blood spattered the area and poured into the shallow creek. Later analysis suggested the murderer may have intentionally positioned Tristan by the water to let him bleed out into the stream. After killing the boy, the perpetrator carried out the gruesome mutilations post-mortem. Flesh was excised with alarming precision. Tristan's genitalia were cut off and taken from the scene. The police could not find these body parts anywhere, indicating the killer removed them as macabre trophies or for some unfathomable reason. It appeared the murderer had also taken Tristan's blue backpack, which was missing from the tunnel. The teachers had identified that Tristan usually carried a blue and yellow school rucksack, but it was nowhere to be found. After completing this horrific ritual, the killer apparently posed Tristan's body, laying him on his back in a peaceful-looking position, hands by his sides, as if he were merely asleep. Then, perhaps realizing a shoe was left near the entrance from the struggle, the killer left the tunnel to retrieve it, and returned to set the shoe on the corpse's chest in a bizarre, almost apologetic gesture. All of this, the investigators believed, took place in an astonishingly short window of time. Based on eyewitness sightings and the condition of the body, police estimated that Tristan was attacked, murdered, and mutilated in under 15 minutes, likely between 3:30 and 3:45 p.m. that day. Amid the blood and chaos of the scene, technicians did manage to recover one promising piece of forensic evidence, a bloody fingerprint. This fingerprint, believed to belong to the killer, was found on a surface at the crime scene. Some reports suggest it might have been on Tristan's backpack or one of his items. Securing that fingerprint gave detectives hope. If they could find a matching print in their databases or from a suspect, they would have their murderer. In 1998, DNA profiling was still developing, but fingerprints were a tried-and-true method. Investigators ran the unknown print through national databases, yet no immediate match turned up. It seemed the perpetrator had no prior criminal record on file, at least not under the German system. The case was shaping up to be as baffling as it was brutal. Even as forensic teams combed the tunnel, other officers were canvassing the surrounding area for witnesses. It wasn't long before the three children who had seen the strange man in the tunnel at 3:30 came forward, once they learned a murder had occurred at that exact spot and time. Their account, combined with the recollections of the woman from the park and perhaps others in the vicinity, allowed police to assemble a rough description of a suspect. According to these witnesses, the individual seen around the tunnel that afternoon was a young adult male, likely in his 20s, around 1.75 meters tall, approximately 5 feet 7 inches. He had a slender, lean build and a pale, unhealthily light complexion. His most striking features were his hair and face. The man's hair was described as long, dirty blonde or light brown, and worn pulled back in a ponytail or braid poking out from under a baseball cap. And perhaps most notably, he had an unusual mark on his face, either a large scar or a cleft lip on his upper lip, visible just below the nose. Witnesses all agreed on one thing: he looked disheveled and unkempt, as if he hadn't bathed or changed clothes in days. This scruffy, gaunt man with the ponytail was seen hurriedly leaving the tunnel area around the time of the murder, and he closely matched the men who had sat down next to Tristan on the park bench earlier. Using these details, police artists created a composite sketch of the suspect's face, hoping it might lead to a name. The sketch depicted a sallow-cheeked young man with stringy long hair, narrowed light-colored eyes, and a distinctive scar cutting into his upper lip. Composite sketch of the unidentified suspect, created by Frankfurt police in 1998 based on multiple eyewitness descriptions. The suspect was described as a pale, slender male in his early 20s with long blonde hair, worn in a ponytail, and a noticeable scar or cleft on his upper lip, visible in the sketch. This image was widely circulated in Germany and even internationally, but the man has never been identified. When the sketch was released to the public, it sent a shiver through the community. Could anyone recognize this face? Investigators plastered the composite image on posters and shared it with law enforcement agencies across Germany and even abroad. Hotlines were set up for tips. Leads poured in by the hundreds, as often happens in high-profile murder cases. Every sighting of a ponytailed man, every report of someone with a facial scar, had to be checked. But no suspects matching the image were definitively found. The man in the sketch seemed to have vanished like a ghost after Tristan's murder. Despite sending the drawing to police forces worldwide, not a single arrest was made from it. It was as if the killer had evaporated into thin air. Criminal profilers weighed in to aid the investigation. Based on the extreme violence and sexual mutilation evident in the crime, experts believe Tristan's killer fit the profile of a particular type of offender. They theorized that the murderer was likely a male between 25 and 35 years old, someone leading a transient or isolated lifestyle. Such an individual might have no close friends or family, exhibiting antisocial tendencies that allowed him to harbor dark fantasies unnoticed. The mutilation of Tristan's body suggested a possible sexual or sadistic motive. Perhaps the killer had pedophilic urges or a deep-seated resentment toward children. Crucially, investigators also considered that Tristan's attacker might not have been a complete stranger. Given Tristan's habit of roaming around alone and chatting with people, especially about animals, it was possible he had encountered his killer before, maybe even befriended him in the days or weeks prior. The idea was chilling. The friendly man with the dog that Tristan was always happy to talk to could have been the same person who lured him to his death. This remained only a hypothesis, but police urged anyone who knew Tristan, or knew of any older person who had recently been seen talking to him, to come forward. They were desperate for any clue that could tie a real name to the specter in the sketch. In the aftermath of the murder, Frankfurt was gripped by fear and sorrow. A child had been slaughtered in their midst, in a park and tunnel where many children passed through each day. Parents grew anxious about letting their kids walk home alone. The brutality of the crime also fueled rampant speculation. Rumors swirled around Höchst about what kind of person could commit such an atrocity. Some speculated about satanic cults or ritual killings. After all, the mutilation seemed ritualistic to the imaginative. Others wondered if Tristan had gotten mixed up with a dangerous crowd. One theory floating in the neighborhood suggested Tristan might have encountered drug dealers or criminals, perhaps after school, and been killed as a result of some gang retaliation or debt. However, police found no evidence that Tristan was involved with any gangs or drug activities. His family and friends insisted he was mostly a homebody, not a delinquent on the streets. It appeared that these theories were nothing more than attempts by a frightened public to rationalize an irrational crime. Tristan's funeral was held on April 7, 1998, less than 2 weeks after his murder. The small cemetery in Höchst filled with mourners stricken by the senseless loss. Tristan's father, Bernd, was devastated. In 3 short years he had lost his wife to suicide and now his only son to an unfathomable murder. Those close to Bernd say he never recovered from the tragedy. At the funeral, as Tristan's coffin was lowered into the ground under an overhanging tree, many noticed Bernd's hollow, grief-stricken gaze, the look of a man whose world had been shattered. The community grieved alongside him. Tristan's classmates, teachers, and neighbors attended, leaving flowers and candles at the gravesite. There was an outpouring of support, but also a palpable undercurrent of anxiety. A child killer was on the loose, and until he was caught, no one felt completely safe. A day after the funeral, an unexpected and eerie event occurred. On April 7, 1998, literally the evening after Tristan was laid to rest, the Frankfurt police received a phone call from a man claiming to be Tristan's murderer. The call came into the police station, not the public tip line. The caller spoke German and said that he was at the Höchst train station, the same station by Brunoask Park, and that he would wait there for police to come arrest him. He described himself to the officer on the line, a man about 180 centimeters tall, 5 feet 11 inches, with long black hair. The caller's voice was reportedly calm. Immediately, squads of officers rushed to Höchst station, hoping this might be the break they needed. They fanned out through the platforms and surrounding streets, but the supposed killer was nowhere to be found. The man who called had either fled or never intended to be caught in the first place. Investigators were left perplexed. Was it a cruel prank by someone who had read about the case? Or could it truly have been Tristan's killer, arrogantly taunting the police and then slipping away into the night? Parts of the mysterious call were later made public, and to this day the voice on the other end has not been positively identified. It was yet another confounding twist, the first of many leads that led investigators down dead ends. In the weeks following the murder, the police task force, codenamed Alaska for this investigation, chased hundreds of tips and potential leads. Psychics called in with visions. Locals reported any strange individuals they could think of. Among the many calls, one lead seemed promising at first. An American woman contacted police to insist that her ex-husband, a German man, was Tristan's killer. She provided detailed clues and information, and for 7 months, detectives followed her tips, trying to verify her claims. It eventually unraveled. The woman confessed she had made the entire story up to get revenge on her ex-husband, with whom she had a bitter divorce. It was a frustrating setback. Precious time had been wasted on a spiteful lie, and the woman was fined for her false accusations. This was the pattern of the investigation. Every time hope glimmered, it seemed to fade just as quickly. The suspect composite yielded nothing solid. The bizarre phone call yielded nothing. And by the end of 1998, Tristan's case was turning cold. However, evidence from the scene still beckoned a solution. The most concrete clue was Tristan's missing backpack. Investigators strongly believed the killer took the blue and yellow school rucksack when he fled, possibly to remove evidence, like the bloody knife, or Tristan's severed body parts, or perhaps by mistake if it got tangled with his own belongings. 4 months, police kept an eye out for the bag. Almost 1 year later, in March 1999, a startling discovery was made. Tristan's backpack was finally found. A hiker stumbled across it in a wooded area near the town of Niedenhausen, about 25 kilometers, 15 miles, northwest of Frankfurt. The bag was confirmed to be Tristan's. Inside were some of his school supplies, and one perplexing item that should not have been there. Tucked among the contents was a road atlas of Germany, written in the Czech language. This atlas did not belong to Tristan. He spoke no Czech and had no reason to own such a map. The presence of the Czech language map suggested that it had been in the killer's possession and was accidentally left in Tristan's bag, or that the killer had deliberately placed it there as a false clue. If genuine, it hinted that the murderer might have a connection to the Czech Republic or Slovakia. Perhaps he had traveled from there, or was planning to flee there. The discovery of the backpack and the Czech atlas breathed new life into the investigation. German police alerted Interpol and reached out to law enforcement in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, sharing the composite sketch and details of the crime. They wanted to know if any similar crimes had occurred there, or if anyone recognized the suspect description. Unfortunately, this avenue produced no breakthrough. Meanwhile, a witness came forward who added an intriguing piece to the puzzle. A woman reported that around the time of Tristan's murder in 1998, she had been in the forests near Niedenhausen, where the backpack was found, and had a strange encounter with a bizarre man in the woods. She recalled that the man acted mentally unstable and was ranting to her about random topics. He claimed he had served in the French Foreign Legion, talked about having lost a herd of sheep, and mentioned that he had recently arrived in Germany from the Czech Republic. This seemed like an uncanny connection. Here was a possibly deranged man, fresh from the Czech Republic, hanging around the same woods where Tristan's Czech atlas containing backpack ended up. Investigators looked into this man immediately. Through French authorities, they identified the individual. He was indeed a former French Foreign Legionnaire. For a moment, it looked like the case might crack open. But yet again, hopes were dashed. The French authorities provided solid alibis and records proving this ex-legionnaire was elsewhere during Tristan's murder. His military service and hospital records placed him out of Germany on that date. He also did not match the physical description of the suspect beyond perhaps having a wild personality. The encounter in the woods turned out to be a strange coincidence, unrelated to Tristan's killer. By the spring of 1999, despite the recovery of Tristan's bag and numerous international inquiries, the case was no closer to being solved than it had been a year earlier. As if the situation couldn't get any more unsettling, another disturbing incident occurred in October 1999. Tristan's grandmother went to visit his grave, as she regularly did, at the Höchst cemetery, only to find something terribly amiss. Overnight, someone had desecrated Tristan's grave. Dirt was shoveled out into a pile and a pit about 1.2 meters deep had been dug into the earth, directly above Tristan's coffin. A plastic tarp lay nearby, which the perpetrator had apparently used to hold the excavated soil. Thankfully, the vandal had not reached the coffin, and Tristan's body was undisturbed. But the open grave sent shockwaves through Tristan's family and the police. Who would commit such a morbid act? Investigators considered the chilling possibility that the killer himself returned to dig up the boy's remains, perhaps for some twisted purpose. However, nothing conclusive could be determined. The desecration was treated as a separate incident. Police theorized that it was likely the work of a mentally disturbed individual who had read about the case and become obsessed, rather than the murderer coming back for some kind of ritual. There were no clear clues left at the grave. Whoever dug it had slipped away unnoticed. This grave incident, though ultimately deemed unrelated to the murder, added another layer of eerie lore to Tristan's story. It underscored how deeply the case had burrowed into the public psyche. Even deranged copycats or voyeurs were lurking at the fringes. By the turn of the millennium, Tristan Brübach's murder investigation was one of the largest and most perplexing in Germany. Years were passing, but the determination to find the killer remained. In 2000 and 2001, as DNA analysis techniques improved, authorities reviewed evidence from the case to see if any biological clues, like hair or skin fragments, could be analyzed for DNA. It's not publicly known if any usable DNA was recovered. The key forensic evidence remained that single bloody fingerprint. To leverage it, in 2002 the Frankfurt police undertook an unprecedented mass fingerprint screening. They systematically invited virtually every male between 15 and 45 years old in the Höchst and Unsolved districts, where Tristan lived and frequented, to voluntarily provide their fingerprints. Additionally, they sought fingerprints from any men in that age range who had been regularly passing through the Höchst train station at the time of the crime. The rationale was clear. If the killer was a local or a commuter, perhaps his prints were already in the net of these thousands of men. The response was extraordinary. By 2014, over 98% of the target population in Höchst had complied with fingerprinting, and over 92% in the neighboring Unsolved had done likewise. That amounted to thousands upon thousands of prints, nearly every possible man who could have been in Tristan's orbit. Yet not one of those fingerprints matched the bloody print from the tunnel. The exhaustive fingerprint dragnet, while a testament to the community's willingness to help, only deepened the mystery. If Tristan's killer wasn't among those thousands of men, who was he? Had he simply passed through and vanished? Was he even still alive? The lack of a match suggested that the murderer might have been a transient outsider, perhaps someone from another region or country, or someone who left Germany shortly after the crime. It was a frustrating reminder that despite all the efforts, the case was still at square one in terms of identifying a suspect. As years stretched into a decade, official resources dedicated to Tristan's case naturally waned. It was never closed, but it became a cold case, pulled out for review every so often. But one man in particular refused to let it fade. Kommissar Uwe Fay, a veteran Frankfurt detective, took over the case and pursued it doggedly through the 2000s and 2010s. Fay had been a police officer for 40 years, and he spent nearly half of that career fighting to solve Tristan's murder. He once commented that not a day goes by that he doesn't think about the case. Under Fay's urging, the investigation was formally reopened in 2013 with a fresh review of evidence and witness statements. Detectives re-interviewed old witnesses, some of whom were now adults themselves, like the children who had seen the suspect, hoping new recollections or modern forensic enhancements might shed light. Two main hypotheses emerged as the focal points. One, that Tristan was killed by someone he knew or had recently met, and two, that Tristan was the victim of a chance encounter with a roaming predator. The first hypothesis was essentially the idea that had been around from the start. Somewhere in Tristan's circle, even a loose acquaintance, lurked a person with a sick compulsion who targeted him specifically. Perhaps this person had groomed Tristan's trust, for example, offering him cigarettes or friendship, and then took the opportunity to isolate and kill him. A supporting piece of this theory came from a teacher who tutored Tristan. She belatedly recalled that a few days before the murder, she had seen Tristan in the company of an unknown man who matched the composite sketch appearance. This man had stood out to her at the time because she noticed Tristan talking to someone much older, and his face stuck in her memory. When she saw the composite image later, she felt it strongly resembled that same man. If her memory was accurate, it means Tristan's killer might have been stalking or grooming him in the days leading up to March 26. The second hypothesis considered that the killer might have been a complete stranger, a drifter or traveler who happened upon Tristan and seized the moment to commit a crime he'd perhaps long fantasized about. In support of this, there was the Czech map clue and the fact that no local prints matched, signs that the murderer could have been from out of town. Maybe he was a long-haul trucker, a rail transient, or someone living off the grid who drifted into Frankfurt that day and left immediately after. Fay and his team weighed these possibilities, but without new evidence, it was hard to progress. The case needed a stroke of luck, or perhaps a new crime with similar hallmarks, to refocus attention. In 2016, an astonishing development did just that. The Tristan Brübach case roared back into the headlines when police announced they had a potential suspect, Manfred Seal. The story of Manfred Seal is like something out of a thriller. Seal was a 67-year-old retiree who had died of cancer in 2014, a quiet man who lived in the Frankfurt area. After his death, his adult daughter was cleaning out a storage garage he had rented, and she made a ghastly discovery. She found human remains and journals with graphic depictions of murder among her father's things. Shocked, she alerted police. Investigators soon realized that Manfred Seal had been living a double life as a serial killer. Hidden behind the facade of a normal life, a steady job, a family, even playing in a jazz band, Seal had preyed on vulnerable women for decades. Authorities linked him to at least 5 murders, and as many as 9, of women between 1971 and 2004. His victims were usually prostitutes or women struggling with addiction or mental illness, people who could disappear without immediate alarm. Seal's modus operandi was horrifically violent. He tortured and dismembered his victims, even exhibiting signs of cannibalism and necrophilia in some cases. Notably, he often kept body parts as trophies, including the genitalia of some victims. These gruesome details sent a jolt through those familiar with Tristan's unsolved murder. The way Tristan had been mutilated, with his testicles removed and flesh cut away, suddenly seemed eerily reminiscent of Seal's known crimes. Could it be that Tristan Brübach had fallen victim to a then-unknown serial killer operating in the area? Commissar Uwe Fay and his colleagues dug into Seal's history. Manfred Seal had lived in Schwalbach, not far from Höchst, meaning he was local to the area of Tristan's murder. The timeline was also plausible. Tristan was killed in 1998, during the period in which Seal was believed to be active. In May 2016, with a mix of hope and gravity, the Hessen State Criminal Police Office held a press conference announcing that they were investigating Manfred Seal in connection with Tristan's murder. This was the first truly solid suspect ever named in the case, even though he was already deceased. The public reacted with a mix of horror and relief. Perhaps the mystery was finally solved, albeit too late for justice. However, as investigators delved deeper, doubts quickly arose. Despite the similarities in brutality, many aspects of Tristan's case did not fit Manfred Seal's known pattern. For one, all of Seal's confirmed victims were adult women. There was no indication he had ever targeted a child or a male. Targeting a 13-year-old boy would be a significant departure for a predator who seemed to focus on women of a certain lifestyle. Additionally, Seal was methodical and patient. He typically stalked and abducted his victims, killing them in secluded spaces over extended periods. It was not his style to brazenly attack in the middle of the afternoon in a public area and perform a rushed mutilation in 15 minutes. By 1998, Seal was also in his 50s, whereas witnesses described Tristan's attacker as a man in his 20s. In fact, photos of Seal from the late 90s showed a middle-aged man with short salt and pepper hair and a beard, not at all matching the ponytailed, scar-lipped youth from the composite sketch. Still, physical appearances can change, and eyewitnesses can be wrong. The real clincher came from forensic comparison. Police could only find 3 fingerprints on record for Seal, and none of them matched the bloody fingerprint from the Liederbach tunnel. After about a year of intense scrutiny, the case against Manfred Seal fell apart. By October 2017, the Frankfurt police quietly announced that Seal was no longer considered a suspect in Tristan's murder, as evidence simply did not place him at the scene. It was a disappointing turn for investigators and the public alike. Many had hoped this longtime boogeyman could explain Tristan's fate, but in the end, it appeared to be a coincidence, 2 separate threads of horror in the same city. With Seal ruled out, Tristan's case returned to uncertainty. Investigators went back to combing through the myriad other possibilities. One name that surfaced in discussions, though not officially confirmed by the case investigators at the time, was Christian Bruckner, a convicted German pedophile and rapist who, in 2020, was publicly identified as the prime suspect in the famous disappearance of 3-year-old Madeleine McCann in Portugal. It turned out Bruckner had lived off and on in Germany and had a long history of child sexual abuse and violent crimes. German authorities in 2020 looked into Bruckner's possible involvement in several unsolved cases of murdered or missing children, and Tristan Brübach's name was on that list. Bruckner was investigated for any links to Tristan's 1998 murder, perhaps due to some similarity in victim profile or just as part of re-examining all cold cases involving children. However, to date, there has been no public evidence connecting Bruckner to Tristan, and no charges have been filed. It stands as another lead that, while intriguing, has not brought the case to resolution. Through all these twists, one thing has remained constant: the dedication to finding Tristan's killer. Detective Uwe Fay continued to pursue the truth, even as years turned into decades. By 2018, on the 20th anniversary of Tristan's death, Fay was in his 60s and nearing retirement, yet he told reporters he would not give up on the case. He painstakingly keeps Tristan's case file open, hoping that advances in technology or a newfound piece of evidence will eventually crack it. Cold case units periodically review the file, and it still draws public interest whenever a vaguely similar crime occurs. In a heart-wrenching turn, Tristan's father Bernd did not live to see the case solved. He died in 2015 at the age of 59, his life marked by immeasurable loss. Before his death, Bernd saw to it that his son's memory was kept alive. Tristan's grave, unfortunately, was subject to the standard 20-year term for maintenance. In Germany, graves are often recycled after a couple of decades if families cannot pay to extend the lease. Bernd's passing meant no immediate family remained to tend Tristan's plot, and by 2018 Tristan's original grave was reclaimed. But locals in Höchst, moved by the tragedy, organized a public initiative to ensure Tristan would not be forgotten. They raised funds for a new memorial stone in the cemetery. In March 2018, a simple stone memorial for Tristan was installed under a tree within sight of where his body rests, so that even without a formal grave, the boy's memory has a place of honor. What remains now is the hope for justice. The Frankfurt prosecutor's office, along with private donors, has put forward a standing reward of €20,000 for any information leading to the capture and conviction of Tristan's murderer. This reward, €15,000 from the state and an additional €5,000 contributed by a private individual, has been advertised since the early years of the investigation. At one point, a much larger reward, €80,000, was offered by another private individual, but it expired unclaimed in 2016. The €20,000 reward remains on the table to this day. Police continue to solicit tips from the public. They ask, did anyone notice a man with wet, blood-stained clothes in Frankfurt that day in 1998? Did anyone see Tristan in the company of an older individual before the crime? The passage of time can change allegiances and fear. Perhaps someone who stayed silent back then might feel safer speaking out now. Over 27 years have passed since Tristan Brübach ran out of school, looking forward to an afternoon of freedom that he never truly got to enjoy. In that time, the world has changed, but for Tristan there have been no more birthdays, no graduation, no adult life, only memories frozen at age 13 and an unsolved tragedy. His case file occupies a special, somber place in the annals of German criminal history, often cited as one of the country's most infamous unsolved murders. Yet the story isn't over. Detectives like Uwe Fay hold on to the conviction that someone out there knows something. Perhaps the killer confided in a friend or cellmate years ago. Perhaps a conscience will be pricked by the memory of a blonde, scar-faced drifter they once harbored suspicions about. Cases colder than this have been solved with a single phone call. Until that day comes, the Liederbach tunnel stands as a silent witness to the crime, now sealed off with gates so that no one can pass through, a physical reminder of a dark deed. The name Tristan Brübach lingers in the minds of Frankfurt residents of a certain age, a cautionary tale of inexplicable evil that struck in their midst. Above all, Tristan is remembered as a boy who deserved so much more from life. He was a gentle soul who loved animals, who faced adversity at home but still tried to find his way in the world. On that fateful afternoon, he should have come home to play his video games or feed his rabbit. Instead, his life was stolen in an act of unspeakable savagery. Who killed Tristan Brübach? It's a question that has tormented all who have examined the case. The answer is still out there, somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. Until justice is done, Tristan's spirit endures in the hearts of his loved ones and the investigators who continue to seek the truth. The case remains open, the reward still offered, and the hope still alive that one day the murderer will be unmasked. In the meantime, the tale of Tristan Brübach stands as a chilling cold case mystery, a poignant reminder of how fragile life can be, and how a community continues to seek closure for the boy who never came home. The tunnel in Höchst keeps its dark secret, but perhaps not forever. One day, a breakthrough may finally shine a light into that darkness, and Tristan's soul can truly rest in peace.